Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Good morning, Toastmasters. According to legend, on August 8th, 1871, the O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern and started what became known as the Great Chicago Fire. That fire went on to burn almost 3.5 square miles of city, 17,000 buildings were destroyed, 300 people lost their lives, and over 100,000 people were made homeless. Now, an event like that, unfortunately, is not uncommon throughout history. And there's actually a common thread to that. And to find that thread, we have to go back in time just a little bit. The American settlers that settled along the eastern seaboard started to migrate out into a frontier area. And that same pattern happened throughout history. Many civilizations that were established in an area would start to migrate and settle. Those settlers would take materials that were abundant in the area and easy to work with to build their structures, their buildings, and their homes. And this pattern would happen for several generations. And then along would come an event like this fire, an earthquake, a massive storm that was a little unusual. And now these settlements that were essentially temporary structures, they've been there for a few generations and they're a little bit established. They would rebuild with materials that were more durable, more suited to their area and climate. And we can now still see the remains of some of those civilizations even thousands of years later. Now, the same thing happened in Chicago. The settlers there rebuilt the city and required non-combustible materials, concrete, brick, steel, things like that. But there was a big difference between this migration and the migrations that happened before it. This migration happened during the Industrial Revolution. And so we could now create things that in past wasn't possible. And one of the things that changed with the sawmills and the modernization of that, we could process timber in a way that just wasn't really economical before into lightweight lumber, the dimensional lumber we see now when we go to Home Depot, something very similar to that. And so a new method of construction was actually invented during this time period in 1833, also in Chicago. And that is the grandfather of our modern stick framing. It was referred to as bloom framing at the time. And those two events are related. Because it was a very lightweight building and organic material, it was very susceptible to fire. And it was the design of those buildings that led to such a massive destruction in those buildings. And so while yes, lessons were learned and Chicago was rebuilt into the second city that it gets called sometimes with steel, brick, other things like that, because that lumber was lightweight, it was cheap, and it was quick to build with, it was here to stay. There were some modifications to it to help reduce the spread of fire, but even almost 200 years later, we still build our homes out of this stick framing. And now in residential construction, almost all of the advances that have come along in that construction have been to help reduce the inherent weakness of this building material. And I want to just cover the top 5 areas that show the weakness of this material. The first of these is water damage. Water damage is the #1 enemy to a building that we have today. To give you an idea of the scale of that, every year in the United States, there's $20 billion in damage caused by water. A lot of that's mold, dry rot, things that will literally eat your building out from the inside out. The second is something we've already talked about, is fire. Every year in the United States, fire causes over $11 billion in damage. And in an effort to find lightweight, cheap solutions, we've actually been putting things in our homes. The material our carpets are made out of, our wall coverings, our paints, window coverings, things like that, have made it even more dangerous. There was a study by the NFPA that back in 1970, if a fire started in your home, you had 17 minutes to get out before the home was fully engulfed. Today, that number is down to 3. You have 3 minutes to get out of your house when a fire starts. So the next weakness doesn't get talked about nearly as much, but actually causes more in dollar value lost. Hail damage. Because we're trying to build lightweight, cheap buildings to not have to have extra engineering in the structure, the materials chosen for roofs and siding lead to $15 billion a year in damage caused by hail. The next one is often comes along the same time as hail, but is wind damage. There's $7.5 billion per year to buildings in wind damage. This is actually an area where some municipalities are starting to make a change. for example, in Miami and Dade County, if you want to build a house, you now have to build it out of concrete block or something similar to help reduce the effects of a hurricane on a house. There are other areas where if you want to still build in a wood home, you have to have continuous metal strapping that goes from one foundation all the way up over the peak of your roof and back down to the other foundation. Continue those hoops all the way down your house just to try and hold your house together in a hurricane or a tornado. And then the last area of the top 5 things that damage the homes is termites and pests. Termites by themselves, $5 billion per year in damage. And then other pests, carpenter bees, carpenter ants, woodpeckers, things like that, are another 1.5 billion. So now we've been racking up billions. This is the top 5, and there's a list that keeps going forever. That top 5 is over $75 billion per year in damage caused to homes, and that really starts to add up over the years. So if we were to build our houses out of something that was more resilient, would all of that go away? No, it's not all going to go away, but it will be significantly reduced. And this is actually reflected in insurance rates. If you build your house out of something that's a little bit more resilient, your insurance rate could go down 50 to 70%. So I mentioned earlier that we have 200 years of material advancement in construction that's all gone towards reducing the weaknesses in lumber. A lot of those actually cause their own problems. We're adding chemicals, plastics, glues, adhesives to our homes, things like borate and other things like that, where yes, it helps your house be a little more resistant to termites, a little more resistant to mold, a little less likely for the structure to start fire. But those themselves cause their own issues. If you have a fire, the smoke in a house fire today is over 200 times more toxic than a house fire 50 years ago because all of the chemicals that we're putting in our house to try and improve them. If you have a flood in your house, and this is something that really never gets talked about, that water will leach those chemicals out of the material into your carpets and onto areas that you can touch. And now you have secondary damage that has to be dealt with. So with all of the technological advances we've had in residential building, we haven't made a lot of improvements. And then you put that in comparison, if you go back to 1833 to now, and all of the technological improvements we've had in every other area of our lives, it to me is absolutely staggering that at the end of the day, we're still building frontier housing. Mr. Toastmaster.